Tim Bowling is the author of numerous collections of poetry, including The Annotated Bee and Me, Fathom, The Book Collector, and The Memory Orchard. He has also published 3 novels, including The Bone Sharps and The Paperboy's Winter, and a memoir entitled The Lost Coast, Salmon, Memory, and the Death of Wild Culture. He has most recently published
Tenderman, which is my 10th collection of poetry, and just about to publish, actually, next week, a new novel called The Tinsmith.
Bowling lives in Edmonton, Alberta. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here.
You're a collector. You've written a terrific book about
thank you.
About collecting. It's called In the Suicide's Library. Beautifully produced book by Gasbro Press. Perhaps if you could just give us a very quick overview of the book, and then we'll get into specific quotes and passages about collecting.
Well, it's a book that I call it my sort of minor midlife crisis, which becomes not so much about sports cars and chasing young women and that sort of thing, but it's a matter of suddenly deciding that I'm very interested in the material book and start to become a collector. And I have an experience in a university library where I find a copy of a Wallace Stevens poetry book that has this incredible, beautiful ownership signature in it of a minor cult American poet from the 1950s who was mostly legendary for either having jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge in 1955 or having disappeared into Mexico. I knew a little bit about him. I knew a couple of his poems, and so I stood there in the library staring at this volume thinking, how on earth did this book get here? And that set me off on about an 8-month journey into exploring this man's life, exploring my feelings about poetry, about book collecting, about parenthood, about a lot of different things.
You mention in the book the fact that collectors experience interesting coincidences quite often, and I experienced one when I was reading your book. It was out in the middle of eastern Ontario, and there's a little bookstore in the town, Golden Lake. So Weldon Keys, the poet in question, who I'd never heard of, was in my mind, and I went to the Golden Lake bookstore, and I'll show you afterwards. There's a book on Weldon Keys that I picked up there. So what are the chances? This is a tiny little bookstore. But maybe you could talk about that. Why do you think we're on the lookout, or we're always, what is it about collecting and coincidence?
Well, I think part of it might simply be that old saw about how when you come across a new word you'd never heard before, and then suddenly you're aware of, you see it 3 or 4 different places, and it's all around you all of a sudden. What happened to me with Weldon Keys, for example, is when I set out to start writing about him, certain things would happen. I would sit in a cafe and I would hear these discussions of suicide around me, like verbatim, and it's like, well, maybe these sorts of discussions were going around me before and I just wasn't tuned to them. But somehow I think it's mysterious. There's a spirit. There's a kind of a spirit in books. Mm-hmm. And this gets into the area of the unfathomable, that I'm not sure I'm qualified to comment on, but strange things do happen in terms of one book leading to another.
You've quoted Emery Walker, who worked with William Morris, and here it goes. The wholeness, symmetry, harmony, beauty, without stress or strain, of the book beautiful, would then be one in principle with the wholeness, symmetry, harmony, and beauty, without stress or strain, of that whole life which is constituted of ourselves and the world, that complex and marvellous whole which, amid the strife of competitive forces, supremely holds its own, and in the language of life writes upon the illuminated pages of the days, the volumes of the centuries, and through the infinitudes of time and space moves rhythmically onward to the full development of its astonishing story, the true archetype of all books beautiful or sublime.
Well, I think anyone who seeks to write a book or make a book doesn't think it's just a matter of paper and ink and glue and bindings and everything else, that there's so much more going on. That harmony that's spoken of there, I think ideally if a book brings all from the writer, the designer, the printer, if all the components, if everyone's on board with trying to create whatever that vision is, it's like any human creation that's going to surpass its time. It's going to be meaningful because it has that harmoniousness. It's going to last beyond its moment.
Because it's got life.
Because it's been invested with passion and craft. You mentioned that earlier today. You're just talking about the value and the importance of craft. And when we talk about the fate of the book and what's going to happen with the material book, I think the book just naturally attracts a certain kind of passion. And I don't mean simply the people, readers and writers, but people. There's a certain real passion, and I'm sure you've spoken to some of these people, that the passion that comes with producing a book. And I don't even really understand. I talk to designers. I've been very fortunate. My work has been brought out in some lovely editions. And when I hear designers and printers talking about marrying the right design to the type of book and to the type of writing, I think, well, you must know it's a skill. It's a real skill,
and it's the use of hands too, often, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
When the book Beautiful is produced.
Well, absolutely. One of the great things about it, I think, is I've worked a lot with Gasborough Press, who's a very fine press in Nova Scotia, and what I love about it is that they're completely up to date with all the modern printing techniques, but whenever they make a little money, they often put themselves right back behind the eight ball by going out and buying some old printing press that somebody's going to get rid of, and they've got to go and get it and then fix it up and put it back into use. So it's you're quite right. It's about more than books in a way. It's a way of life. I mean, it's an attitude towards life, and it does involve real hands-on application, which is wonderful with intellectual work. If you get that combination.
Well, in fact, Crispin Elstead talked about exactly that, the Barbarian Press, marveling at the fact that he actually could do something with his hands and connect it with another love.
Right.
Well, let's move a little further along in the book, where you say, I had been reading seriously for most of my life and had only regularly encountered this word in two places. Now, the word is covet. The Bible, where coveting is definitely frowned upon, and in books about book collecting, where coveting is, generally speaking, the whole point.
Well, I was not a book collector. I was a reader who didn't care what the edition was. Up until I was about, not that many years ago, actually, half a dozen years ago. Partly that's what In the Suicides Library is about. It sort of happens around the time that I'm starting to become a book collector. One of the amazing things to me about writers is writers, produce books but have such often little understanding. First of all, writers are not often book collectors. Writers don't care. Probably because I've heard it put, writers are more interested in 100 printings than in one.
They want to get it out of the first edition.
Yeah, they want to get it out of the first edition into many. Believe me, I understand that. But at the same time, even that lack of knowledge of simply the parts of a book, like the actual material quality of a book and what goes into making a book. And I'm still remarkably ignorant on it, but I've begun to get interested. And the covetousness. Well, first of all, it's great fun to read books about book collecting. And what I wanted to do with this book in particular was I wanted to write a book that was about book collecting and the passion of it, that had a bit of a fictional narrative to it, in the sense that it has a narrative arc. It's a story and there's a quest. Because I'd read a lot of books about book collecting, and as much as I love them as books in terms of stories, they're a bit dry. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try to do a little combination. And it was fun. It was great fun to read.
Well, it was fun to read too, because there is this rendezvous with the bridge that we keep getting foreshadowings of. As A. Edward Newton put it, great collector, the better the book, the higher the price, the better the bargain.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good justification to blow a lot of money.
And the other thing that goes hand in hand with that is book collectors saying that you never regret what you bought. You regret what you didn't buy. And I've experienced that. So it's not buyer's remorse. It's whatever the opposite of that is, where you just, for one reason or another, you couldn't put the money down to buy this. But it's like any, I mean, we're fundamentally talking about a form of materialism. You're collecting things, right? Even though these things have the essence of human, spirit in them, they're still things. You see it in the book collecting world quite a lot. Someone will go absolutely whole hog at it for years, and then just completely abandon it after 15 or 20 years, or even 5 years, 10 years. It'll be so important, and then they have to walk completely away. That's interesting, and maybe there's an element of the gambler in all of this that makes it, maybe a bit dangerous.
I was fortunate enough to have a one-on-one meeting with the South African author J.M. Coetzee. I'd exchanged emails with him periodically over the last number of years, and he agreed to sign all of my books. So I lugged about 40 of them down. And while he was signing them, I think I must have gone through some kind of mini crisis, because I was thinking to myself, why am I doing this? Am I kidding myself? I've got some kind of special connection with this man? Is it because these signatures are valuable? Why am I doing this? Do you ever get to that?
I mean, I make the point in the book. The whole thing is very sentimental. Fundamentally, it's like sports. If you watch the NHL, you have to pretend that it matters in order to get anything out of it.
And you have to invest emotionally.
You have to play the game, so to speak. And if you're going to be a book collector, it's perfectly fine to have those moments of doubt, I think. But at the same time, maybe those moments of doubt keep you from being the bibliomaniac.
The gambler. The truly addicted.
The truly addicted, right.
Yeah.
If you can stand outside and say, well, this is all maybe a little bit silly. But you know what? I've had those moments, but it's fun. For me, it's all about the personalized library.
Yeah.
I want to have personalized books signed by often living authors. But if I have the choice between paying a premium for a first edition that's in beautiful shape, or paying less for one that has an association quality to it, but the condition's not as good, I'll go for the association always, because that's what it is for me. Because books for me are the products of people who worked on them. That's what matters to me.
That they've touched it for one thing, or
Delmore Schwartz, was an American poet who said all he ever wanted was a seat at the table. I think that's what it is for me. I like to imagine, if I have all these personalized books on my shelves, I feel like I'm participating. Because the world, the fortunes of the literary author, you're blown one way and the other, and what can you count on? What you can count on are the writers and the books that made you want to be a writer. It's a refuge, I guess. But it's also more than that for me. It's an inspiration. The idea that I can care so much about the books and who wrote them may be a part of its ego, in the sense that I'd like somebody else to care that much about my books. It might be partly that.
Now, this is something that's very dear to my heart, and that is coming up with a considered defense or argument in support of the importance of collecting to culture. You thought about that much?
Yeah, like many people today, I think with the digital age, the way books and manuscripts have mattered as cultural products is rapidly shifting. Just in terms of what happens when you have writers who, if they don't have handwritten drafts of things, and you don't have that trail from the first draft to the next draft to the next draft to the next draft, if it's all just in the ether, then what is the cultural importance of a signature on a book compared to all these different stages from a literary analysis point of view? I think collecting, it is absolutely a form of archive work, but how do we know what's going to be important? I don't think it can be that cold-blooded. For me, I don't think I question it. If I love something enough, if I'm passionate enough about it to want to collect it, then I just naturally assume that it's going to matter to someone else. Maybe not a lot of people. And the culture, I mean, that's a big word. I don't know what that means. Poetry, for example, or any of the art forms, what is their cultural significance? What is the cultural significance of poetry in Canada today? Al Purdy was a fairly significant Canadian poet, and after he died, he was attacked quite a bit, and I'd say overrated, and this and that. Irving Layton had a bit of that same thing sort of happen. And
you can buy their first edition signed for pittance.
Absolutely, a pittance. Well, is that going to always be the case? I don't know. But does that mean that they're not important culturally to Canada? I don't know how important they are. There's a certain point, I think, where when you care enough about something, whether it's poetry or opera or whatever it is, that you kind of tend to lose a sense of reality for what other people's reality is.
Yeah, I think you're right. You have to have that belief that what you're doing is, and what you love is worth loving.
Absolutely, but I think I'm not deluded about it anyway. I don't expect, and it's the same when people talk about poetry in general and bringing poetry to the people and making poetry more popular. And I gave up on that a long time ago because I just thought, well, poetry's always going to be, and it's always mattered to some people, but not a lot. And it matters so intensely to that small group of people that that's enough for me. Maybe that's true of book collecting too. Maybe it's only ever going to matter to a small percentage of people. And I'm not talking simply about the financial value of books, but in our society anyway, that is a measure of something's value, a very big measure. And if you see what's happened with the price of collectible books, in the last 25 or 30 years, I guess that's cultural significance.
In fact, it's gone down.
I guess it reached a high point a while back. But still, I mean, the fact that you go on the internet and you can see a first edition of, I'll pick any classic book that you've looked at in university. Let's just say it'll cost an amount of money that would shock my mother or anybody that's not actively involved in the book world. To say that you'd spend $100,000 on a copy of, The Great Gatsby. For most people, I think that's ridiculous. Because you can get the same thing in a paperback,
That's right.
And you can read it. Why would you need to do that? Why would you do that? I mean, because that is a lot of money.
I don't think you'd be able to find a Canadian book that goes for that, though.
While Canada's status as a cultural producer is still, despite what Canadians might think, I've gone. You know what, Nigel? I mean, it's that sort of stuff is right out of your control anyway. I mean, a Canadian, but what is the most valuable Canadian book?
It's a good question.
From a collectible point of view, in literary terms.
I got the Canadian Governor General's award winners here. I got through all of them except for one that no one seems to be able to find.
What year is that?
It was late 30s, early 40s. It's called The Dark Weaver by Laura Salverson. But I'm telling you, I was able to acquire, and most of them are signed. And I think the most expensive was The Dance of the Happy Shade. I don't have that one signed, but I think that was like $600 or $700.
I was going to say you can get a signed copy of that in the first edition for not much more than that.
Yeah.
What Canadian writer has a higher international reputation than Alice Munro?
No, maybe Mordecai Richler, but Alice Munro certainly.
Yeah, you're quite right. Well, and you're right that if you look at comparable writers from other countries, you're not talking $700 or $800. I mean, would it then be a wise thing to go out and buy a lot of Alice Munro's first? Not necessarily, right? No. Because it may never, translate into that kind of financial value. But is there any doubt the importance of Alice Munro's writing to Canadian culture? I don't think there can be. There should be.
So what do you do then once you collect? Is it incumbent upon the collector to do something with their collections, to think about them, to write about them? It seems to me that that's the reflection of the collector on his or her collection is what's important.
Yep. Walter Benjamin and the forming the magic circle. That's actually a very good point, because if you look at there's a lot of the books about book collecting are written by collectors who didn't write other things. Whatever they did for a living, they weren't writers per se, but by the act of collecting, eventually they decided to write about it. And I think probably just because the passion gets to be such that
you got to share it.
You've got to share it. And that's because I talk a bit about the library being a refuge, and a sanctuary, and you get away from the world that way. But anybody that gets involved in book collecting knows, especially nowadays with how much you can, communicate with people all over the place about your love of books, that It's a very gregarious pursuit. It can be. I mean, it doesn't have to be. You can do it entire. You can be a complete hermit if you want. Especially now, you don't even have to deal with book dealers. You don't have to go to bookstores if you don't want to. You can do it all over the net. But I think most people love to talk about it.
The collector part of it is the desire to talk about how they acquired the book, why the book's important, to share. I've interviewed one of the great collectors alive right now, Mark Samuels Lasner is his name, and he collects the Bodley Head, among many other things. He tells me that he has people in pretty well every city, if not around the world, and certainly in the United States, where he can go to. He can go to that city and just feel really at home, which is it's pretty great feeling.
That's a bit of what poetry's like in Canada. I can go most places in the country and feel like there's a poet I come into contact with before that I could go and have a coffee with. It's another level when you're talking about a fellow book collector. Because, if you can combine poetry with a book collector, then
dynamite.
Well, I have a long-standing correspondence going with William Hayen, is an American poet who lives in New York, and he's had an amazing book collection that he started collecting in the 60s. He sold it off to Rochester University, I think, eventually. There's the meeting that I'm eventually going to have. I'm going to one day get to his home in Brockport, New York, and we'll have a good chat about poetry and book collecting. So that's sort of a Christmas present for a year somewhere down the line.
I'm speaking with Tim Bowling about his book, In the Suicide's Library, A Book Lover's Journey, published by Gasbro Press. Next quote. Without the material temptation of the book, where would I find the spiritual growth?
Drawing a blank on that. I mean, that's yours too. That's mine too. I know. I mean, poets have to deal, if they're going to write effective poems, have to deal in the concrete rather than the abstract. So maybe I'm making a relationship there between the material and the actual world that you can see and touch. I don't think I would have much spiritual growth if I just laid on the grass and thought about God. I need to smell the grass. I need to have the concrete, physical presence, the material presence. But books are so clearly more than just material products.
Material is one word, but temptation is the other. It's the temptation of the material.
Right. Yeah. Well, certainly the case in that book, anyway. The material temptation of a particular volume keeps the journey going through the pages there.
Who has not met the species of collector who would view an item again and again, play with it like a cat with a mouse, hesitate to arrive at a decision, and yet all the while wanting it, for fear, largely not self-realized, of losing, by gaining possession of the thing, the excitement and fun which he experiences in dallying with the present object of his fancy? That was bookseller Gabriel Wells.
I've just been teaching The Great Gatsby, and that's just Jay Gatsby. That's the green light at the end of the dock. As long as you've got that green light there, you've got that desired volume. As soon as you buy it, this comes up in book collecting material all the time, in book collecting literature. Once you purchase the volume, a little life goes out of it. Right? It's
almost like a sexual conquest too, in a way.
Well, and a lot of book collectors make that kind of comparison, which is taking it a little too far for me. but it's certainly half the fun, more than half the fun, is wrestling with yourself about whether you should go ahead and buy something. If I don't buy this, I could buy this.
Plus, there's an adrenaline.
Absolutely.
That comes. It's am I going to blow all that money on this? Am I really just about to spend all this money that I don't have?
Yeah. And of course, with books, though, what's funny about it is, if you were doing that, in Vegas or something, and you wouldn't have any kind of what you mentioned already, the notion of collectors and the value of collecting to the culture, right? Well, collectors can delude themselves into being noble, about their spending. It's like, and I think I talk about that in this book, that no one else knows the value of this particular Wallace Stevens collection except me. I have to save it for the future. And
I'm the hero. It's also, there's a power in that too, and you do refer to it. The fact that you have this knowledge, and you can go into a place, and most people don't have that knowledge, but you know that edition versus that one is way more valuable.
Well, you hear this from a lot of people in the book antiquarian book business, is that a lot of that fund's gone, disappeared.
It really has. It's been. It takes the wind out of the sails. Every Joe can just look it up on the net. Yeah. When I think about what booksellers should be doing to encourage collectors, it's to seed their shelves with finds.
No, absolutely. And I think if I have a sort of a fantasy book dream, plot me down in New York's 4th Avenue in 1958 with a list of Canadian books or something that I'm going to look for. Serendipity Books in California just went out of business.
Yeah.
And I never got there. And it was one of these great, gigantic sort of bookstores that had an inventory that was vast and you could disappear into it. And the prices may not have been updated for a long time, but the owner, Peter Howard, who had died recently, a couple of years ago, he would know the value of everything because he bought everything. And so he had that kind of bookseller's mind. Those sorts of places where you can just wander into. I mean, I spent, as a young man, I used to go into McLeod's books in Vancouver, and I still do when I go back to Vancouver.
Just there,
and
piles
and piles and piles and narrow little aisles, and you go down into that basement, and
there's a good poetry section in there.
There's a good poetry section, and you can find. I mean, the last time I was there, I picked up a signed Adrian Rich book for $20 or something, and that serendipity. I wasn't looking for it.
Yeah.
I just happened to go in there, and I don't think McLeod's. I don't think they have a internet. I don't think they'd bother at all.
Yeah. Good on them.
Well, I wish 50% of booksellers would still. I wish they'd all go back to that if they could. But on the other hand, I'm sure you would admit this too, that it does work both ways. I have books on my shelves that I probably never would have found. Like with the Weldon Keys, one of the things I talk about in the book is how the only thing that he had in his estate after he disappeared that was of any value, he was a book collector and he had some lovely books.
As was Wallace Stevens.
As was Wallace Stevens, yeah. So I kind of set out in a mild way to see how many, because he signed all of his books. He had this lovely calligraphic signature, and I thought, well, I'm just gonna keep checking the net and see if I can find Weldon Keys signed books, and I have about 9 of them now.
And you could probably get them because he's not that well known. You could probably get them for. Maybe not.
No, it's funny because sometimes when someone's obscure, and he worked with some fine presses, the Grabhorn. You would think you could get it for a pittance, but it's a little bit more than that because people who know. But if you're looking on the internet, I can only find the ones that someone has recognized as being an important Weldon. Like there may be Weldon Keys books from his library that are sitting somewhere in some bookstore that the owner never heard of Weldon Keys and hasn't even hasn't bothered to punch his name in to see anything.
That's what you live for, I guess.
That's what you hope for, and I just think it's so much harder to find that. But people that do a lot of book buying off the internet, they still have their finds.
Books might not be life, but they do shatter the groove.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm quoting Wallace Stevens there. The book talks an awful lot about the multiple selves we have within us, and we all have many choices always to make as to how we're going to live, but mostly we don't continually change. What fascinates me about Weldon Keys all his life long, he talked about the other self and just disappearing and starting a new life, and of course it just as suicide occurs to any intelligent person as an option, at least. Of course it's an option. It doesn't mean you're going to pursue it, but you can be aware of it. The same thing happens to me, but then Weldon Keys was sort of an entree for me into that whole realm of thinking about partly middle life and thinking about how my past changes, what are the changes going to be now, and how am I going to shatter the groove. And Wallace Stevens had said that books shatter the groove. It's a way that you can change, but not so that you necessarily ruin the lives of everyone around you. You don't have to so dramatically always alter your life.
What do you mean by, again, books shatter the groove?
Well, like if you get into a pattern where life seems to be going along in the same, needle in a record. But if your life seems to be in a rut, well, sometimes you can read a book.
A book will change your life.
A book can change your life.
Right.
A book can give you an insight, point you in a fresh direction, which doesn't require you to, to go off and live in another country.
Right, or as you say, get a sports car or whatever we're talking about. Yeah. Leaving your wife for another woman, moving to an exciting or an exotic land, jumping off a bridge to your death, even collecting books. Behind all these acts lies a primordial desire for rebirth, for a transformation from one existence to another, which includes, of course, non-existence. Every civilization and culture has trafficked in the magic of change.
Well, I think we're sort of continually in the process of changing. Or it's just simple biology, and I think that is a big challenge, and I think it's especially a big challenge in our society, because from the time we're born, we're encouraged to fulfill ourselves. We don't necessarily know what that means to do it. So this process of being restless and dissatisfied is sold to us.
It's a whole societal pressure to not do what you're passionate about, because if everyone did that, then we'd have chaos.
There's two things going on there. On the one hand, we're not all supposed to go running off, and it's not human nature for that to happen anyway. Most people can't.
They crave order.
People have to have structure, and one of the interesting things about Weldon Keys is that he was the opposite of a bohemian. I mean, he was a very, very conservative, and conservative in terms of it. He dressed conservatively. He was very neat. He was very orderly.
Handsome.
Handsome. But he had his issues, and he kept them under wraps for as long as he could.
And then it exploded.
And frankly, in his case, I think his wife was alcoholic, and he finally split from her. But shortly after the divorce, that's when he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. It's like the order that they had built. Somehow he couldn't survive without it. Weldon Keys' most famous poem is called For My Daughter, and it's famous because there's a shock line at the end that talks of, these speculations sour in the sun. I have no daughter, I desire none. And it's sort of a parody of Yeats.
Sounds like a sonnet almost.
Well, it is.
And,
and he's one of the bitterest, bleakest poets in history. So that's actually where most people know him from. That's his most anthologized poem. But he never had children, and his wife was probably even more opposed to the idea. So part of me as a father speculates on what parenthood does to the groove. It kind of loads those questions about shattering the groove. It makes them a little different. When there's repercussions to whatever you do to shatter the groove, if it's more than just you, it complicates the decision, in ways that matters more to some people than others. But anyway, all of it, really, Nigel, all of it, collecting, parenting, it's all about investing life with some meaning, some purpose. And I think in my case, a lot of it has to do with, I just feel happy when I look at my shelves and I take down a book, and especially one that I've spent a fair bit of money on, and I take it down and I look at it, and I just feel I feel just good about the human species, and I need to.
The fact that someone took the time to produce this, and
that there's this chain of being, chain of creation that you can participate in, and a lot of people don't, and I feel I'm grateful. Every time I look at my bookshelves, I'm grateful. I'm grateful to whatever forces conspired to make me appreciate the book. I'm 48 now. If I have any regret at all, it's that I wish I had been a book collector 25 years ago.
I feel exactly the same way. I just got into it maybe a dozen or 13 years ago. I always acquired, quite an acquirer, but not a collector.
Yeah.
And boy, it just is like a brilliant door opening up.
Yeah.
With new reasons to go into every store.
Yeah.
It seems like every couple of months I got some new reason to go into the same store.
Yeah.
So it's a different store every time.
Yeah. It really is a wonderful pastime. It can take over if you let it.
It can, yeah. So it's an attempt to find meaning in our lives. And how does it answer that attempt then?
I think it would be the same as poetry. I don't know that there's a final answer. I think it's a process. My own feeling about it is that there are times when I think, okay, that's it. I can't spend any more money on books. I got to stop. And a little part of the book collecting thing that comes in is almost a kind of I wish that I could go back to not caring about editions sometimes because then I could go into these bookstores and I could just pick up any old cheap copy of a book that I read before that I love.
And be happy.
And have it on my shelves and think, wow, I'm going to read that again now. And party with my kids too. I think, like, I should have all kinds of cheap copies of all the classics lying around so that they can just pick them up, right? I don't want them just taking down my
without you yelling at them
of Alice Munro and dropping food all over it. Part of it is valuing it so much. It's exactly like poetry. The poet Don Demansky says that at the moment that you're writing it and creating it, you have to believe it is the most important thing in the world, but at the same time you have to believe you yourself are absolutely meaningless in the universe. You don't really matter, but the poem absolutely matters. And I think collecting is somewhat like that. One of the great heartaches for any collector is what happens when the Grim Reaper starts to become more of a, what are you going to do with the books? Where are the books going to go? Now, often over the past century, books have been donated to libraries. Well, what happens now that libraries are getting rid of material books? The libraries are going increasingly electronic. They won't want books. So where are the books? Where are the libraries going to go?
There's two types of collectors, or two approaches to the end. One is, I'm just going to throw them back in the ocean so that others can enjoy what I've enjoyed. But there is this sense or this desire for immortality. Mm-hmm. I have gathered this information, this content together in a way that no one else ever has, and it's meaningful because of this and this and this.
Well, your Governor General's award winners, like I'm sure you can't bear to think of just willy-nilly selling them off or letting them all go just without some recognition of having put that together, right? It says something. Like maybe this is where the writing comes from. Maybe the collector becomes the writer,
the scholar,
because he's got to mark the achievement, even if the books are eventually dispersed. But there's going to be a document that's going to say that they were together. And here you get into the realm. I did something that I never even was not even part of my vocabulary up until a few years ago. I commissioned a book plate. I had a fellow from England who I happened to get into touch with through Crispin Elstead, a man named Andy English in England, who I found out was not that expensive to get my own book plate. So I had him do some up for me that worked with him and came up with an image that I'm really delighted with.
What is that image?
Well, I come from a salmon fishing family, so it's a little picture of a salmon gill netter with a salmon in it, and it's sort of a figure that I think of as my father. Simple, but it's a striking little image. And I'm in the process now. I put one into a book about every once a week. A part of me thinks that if the books go back into the ocean, then someone will have the experience that I had with the Weldon Keys book. And that's how the dialogue continues. Someone might somewhere in the world flip open a book, and there's my book plate, and maybe they've heard of my name somehow, from something somewhere. None of us know, the fate of our own writer as writers. Your books can wind up anywhere. But I think I've had as much fun. I don't know how much you read book collecting books.
Well, I've got a lot of them. Yeah,
I love them.
I'll tell you. You see that over there? Those are all publishers' histories.
Oh yeah,
all of them.
Yeah,
and so reading a publisher's history is like going into a bookstore, because there is mention of important, interesting books that have come in. That's what this whole project's about.
Yeah, it's a good
I know
project.
exactly what you're talking about.
I just bought some Herbert Faulkner West books written in the 1920s and 1930s. There's one essay in one of them talks about his Robert Frost collection. And I enjoy hearing the passion of someone who's been dead for 50 years about the meaning that books had for him in his life. And I think, boy, it's precedent. If this was an intelligent, sensitive person, and this gave him pleasure and meaning, then that's probably a pretty good endorsement.
I think it's going to keep us alive a bit longer than we might otherwise have been on the earth.
Book collectors traditionally and booksellers live a long time. They don't want to let go of the books. Yeah.
Well, here's to many more years of happy hunting. Thanks.
Absolutely. You're very welcome. Thank you.
I've been speaking with Tim Bowling, who is the author of In the Suicides Library, a book that has a narrative arc that delves into the mysterious minds of book collectors. And most recently you're working on...
Oh, well, I have a new novel coming out next week, but I'm working on a project about Buster Keaton, actually. This is my love of books, and now I think I'm going to touch a little bit on my love of silent film and how it relates. The 1920s, when the height of Buster Keaton's art form, in some ways are a lot like today. There's a lot of really interesting parallels. So, and I understand. I was looking at a paper here today that some almost silent film won the Academy Award or something.
Artists,
so maybe it's the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Part of, who knows.
Best of luck with that.
Thank you.
Yeah.